The year was 1873, and the town of Jasper, Alabama was alive with anticipation. A traveling fair had come to the countryside, its lanterns glowing like stars brought down to earth, its music carrying across the fields where crops had only just recovered from the war's devastation. For two young brothers, Henry and Elijah Carter, the fair promised wonder, escape, and the thrill of a night unlike any other. Witnesses recalled them walking side by side beneath the flickering light, their laughter rising above the sounds of fiddles and fortune-tellers. Yet, by dawn, that laughter would become something else entirely, a sound their mother swore she still heard, long after her sons had vanished. They never came home. Their bed lay untouched, their boots still by the door. The family dog howled into the night as if it sensed an absence more profound than death. And though search parties combed the woods and the fairground alike, no sign of the brothers was ever found. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, not a single clue to mark the direction of their steps. Officially, it was called a tragedy. Some whispered of a crime, of robbers or kidnappers preying on boys too naive to sense danger. Others, however, leaned on the darker comfort of folklore. They said the brothers had been taken, not by men but by something else entirely. Eyewitnesses swore they saw a tall figure in black trailing the boys through the crowd, his hat brim concealing his face. A young girl later testified she saw them enter a tent that was gone the next morning, as if it had never been pitched at all. And in the churchyard, their grieving mother told the preacher she heard her son's voices outside her window, faint and fleeting. At the exact hour they disappeared. What truly happened that night remains one of Alabama's oldest cold cases, its edges blurred by the passage of time and the persistence of myth. Rational explanations compete with chilling accounts, leaving only contradiction behind. Were Henry and Elijah swallowed by human cruelty, victims of greed or hatred in an era still reeling from war? Or were they claimed by something the town could not name, something that slipped through the fairground's music and shadows, choosing its prey with quiet precision? This is the story of the brothers who never returned, a tale balanced uneasily between history and legend. Their disappearance is not merely a mystery of facts and records, but a mirror of human fear, guilt, and belief. Each retelling carries its own weight, the justice of rumor, the comfort of faith, the thrill of superstition. But beneath it all lingers a silence that no explanation has ever filled. And so we begin where the story has always begun. At the fairground, beneath the lanterns, where laughter once rang out into the Alabama night, only to vanish forever. The story of Henry and Elijah Carter begins long before the night of their disappearance, in the soil of post-war Alabama, where every family carried scars that time refused to heal. They were farm boys, raised beneath the shadow of oak trees and the lingering echoes of cannon fire. The Civil War had ended less than a decade earlier, but its aftermath remained in the cracked fences, in the empty chairs at dinner tables, in the whispers of widows who had lost too much to silence. Against that backdrop, Henry and Elijah were seen as symbols of resilience, two young lives unbroken, full of energy, laughter, and an innocence that their community clung to like a fragile lifeline. Henry the elder was 17, broad-shouldered for his age, with the kind of steady gaze that made neighbors believe he would one day inherit his father's quiet authority. Elijah, 15, was more restless, a boy with quick hands and quicker thoughts, who seemed to live in two worlds at once, half in the fields where he worked, half in the books he borrowed. Some of them whispered to be dangerous, in a town where superstition carried as much weight as scripture. Together, they were inseparable, their latter often echoing across the hills as they worked, played, or wandered into the woods that ringed their farm. Tosum, they were the pride of the community. Their teachers spoke of their diligence, their mother of their kindness, their peers of their loyalty. But not all stories about the brothers were flattering. Beneath the surface of admiration swirled rumors that painted them in darker shades. Henry, it was said, carried a temper that could spark like dry tinder. He had once bloodied another boy's nose in a fight at the general store, though he insisted it was provoked. Elijah, meanwhile, unsettled neighbors with his fascination for books that delved into subjects the local preacher condemned as unholy. Folk medicine, superstitions, even whispered translations of European texts that blurred the line between science and sorcery. It was this contrast, innocence against suspicion, resilience against trauma, that made the brothers both beloved and feared. They represented the dual face of post-war Alabama itself, one side yearning for normalcy, the other haunted by shadows it could neither forget nor fully explain. For some, Henry and Elijah were simply boys shaped by hardship, doing their best to carve out joy in a land still bleeding. For others, they embodied something more unsettling, as though their laughter masked secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. In church, the preacher praised Henry for his strength, then cautioned Elijah for his defiance of holy order. In school, friends remembered the brothers' loyalty, their shared jokes, their determination to protect one another. But on the edges of town, whispers grew louder, that Henry's temper foreshadowed a darker violence, that Elijah's curiosity invited forces better left untouched. The same voices that once praised the boys for resilience now hinted they carried within them the seeds of their own destruction. Their mother, Margaret Carter, rejected such rumors. Widowed by the war, she clung fiercely to her sons as both memory and legacy of her husband. To her, Henry's strength was a reflection of his father's courage, and Elijah's questioning mind was evidence of God-given intelligence. Yet even she admitted in moments of exhaustion that Elijah's late-night readings unsettled her, the way he muttered lines to himself by candlelight, words that sometimes did not sound like English at all. Still, she loved them, perhaps more fiercely because of these flaws. In her mind, they were not merely sons, but anchors keeping her from drifting into despair. Neighbors often recalled seeing the brothers together at twilight, walking the dirt roads, sharing secrets that no one else heard. Their bond was undeniable, a partnership that seemed unbreakable. And yet that very closeness gave rise to speculation. If one strayed, would the other follow? If one harbored darkness, would the other defend it to the end? The Carters' farm itself carried an uneasy reputation. Though fertile, it was bordered by woods where strange lights were sometimes reported, and where livestock occasionally vanished without explanation. Old stories claimed the land had once belonged to a man accused of witchcraft, though no records survived to confirm it. Elijah's fascination with the woods only deepened the unease. He was seen wandering there alone, sketching plants, collecting stones, and once, carrying back what looked to be a bundle of feathers tied with twine. When asked, he simply smiled and said it was for a project. Henry, in contrast, embodied the town's ideals, hard-working, protective, and direct. But his temper, when it flared, reminded some too strongly of soldiers they had known, men broken by war, capable of violence they did not fully control. One story told of Henry striking a mule so hard it stumbled, his face pale with a rage he could not explain. Another recounted how he chased off older boys who mocked Elijah, swinging a stick with a ferocity that frightened even his allies. Such contradictions made the brothers difficult to define. Were they simply children of their time, scarred but strong, shaped by a harsh world into complex young men? Or were they, as some whispered, touched by something beyond ordinary life? Henry by the violence of history, Elijah by the pull of forbidden knowledge. Psychologists today might interpret Elijah's obsession with strange books as a response to trauma, a way of seeking control in a world where death had stolen too much. They might see Henry's temper as unprocessed grief, the shadow of a father's absence weighing heavily on a boy forced to grow too fast. Yet in 1873 Alabama, psychology was a word rarely spoken, and explanations came instead from pulpits and gossip. To neighbors, Henry's temper was a warning, Elijah's curiosity a sin. The brothers carried these labels quietly, continuing to live their lives in the rhythms of farm work, church attendance, and fleeting moments of joy. Their mother often described how they sang together while working in the fields, voices harmonizing in a way that seemed to bind them not just to each other, but to the land itself. Friends remembered them as protectors, standing up for those who were bullied or cheated. And yet, every story of kindness seemed to have its counterbalance in a darker tale whispered when backs were turned. As the year 1873 unfolded, the brothers grew restless. The war had ended, but opportunities were scarce. The fair, when it came, promised more than entertainment. It promised a glimpse of a wider world. For Henry, it was a chance to prove himself, to step out from under the weight of his father's memory. For Elijah, it was a place where stories and curiosities collided, where he might find new wonders to feed his hungry mind. No one could have predicted that the fair would be the last place they were ever seen. Yet in hindsight, the stories of their lives seemed to foreshadow it. The temper that flared unpredictably, the curiosity that strayed too far, the land itself steeped in rumor. All of it wove a tapestry of innocence, entangled with suspicion. In the days leading up to the fair, their mother noticed a change. Henry grew more withdrawn, as though carrying a burden he could not share. Elijah became more animated, speaking of dreams he had. Dreams of lights in the woods, of voices calling from beyond the trees. He described them with wonder, not fear, insisting they were guiding him somewhere important. Margaret scolded him, reminding him of the dangers of idle imagination, but the words seemed to roll off him like water from stone. And so the stage was set. Two brothers bound by love yet divided by whispers, walking into a night that would seal their fate. Their lives, so ordinary in many ways, had become extraordinary through the weight of perception, admired, feared, doubted, cherished. Every story told about them after their disappearance was colored by these contrasts, making it impossible to separate truth from myth. What remains certain is this: Henry and Elijah Carter were more than names on a cold case file. They were boys of flesh and blood, shaped by hardship and hope, carrying both innocence and shadow within them. To their mother, they were everything. To their neighbors, they were both promise and threat. To history, they became symbols of a mystery that has never been solved. And as we look back on their lives, we are left with the question that haunted every telling of their story. Were they victims of chance, of human cruelty, or of something that had marked them long before the night of the fair? The night of the fair should have been a celebration, a chance for the people of rural Alabama to briefly escape the weight of war's aftermath and the daily struggles of survival. It was the summer of 1873, a season when fields baked beneath the sun and families prayed the rains would not fail them. Yet for one night, hardship was set aside. Lanterns were strung between posts, wagons converted into booths, and fiddles carried their sharp, joyous music into the warm night air. The fairground glowed like a pocket of wonder carved into a landscape otherwise marked by exhaustion. Henry and Elijah Carter had been anticipating this night for weeks. For Henry, the fair represented independence, a chance to step beyond the shadows of his farm and into a crowd where he was simply another young man, strong and capable, free from the whispers that dogged him. For Elijah, it was enchantment. The books he loved came to life in the colors, sounds, and strange curiosities gathered from across the county. Their mother had pressed coins into their hands, reminding them to spend wisely, but her smile betrayed her delight at seeing her sons lit with anticipation. The fairground itself was a swirl of sensation. Smoke rose from roasting pits, carrying the aroma of pork and cornmeal. Children darted between booths, their laughter mingling with the barkers' cries advertising games of chance. Lanterns flickered overhead, casting shadows that danced as merrily as the music. Men tested their strength at iron hammers, women admired ribbons and trinkets, and the whole place seemed alive with a heartbeat that pulsed louder than the countryside had heard in years. The Carter brothers were spotted by several townsfolk that evening, moving together as always, their heads bent close in conversation. One witness recalled Henry tossing a ring in a bottle game, his grin wide when it landed true. Another swore Elijah lingered long by a stall where an old woman sold charms and powders, asking questions that made her frown. Friends remembered them joining in laughter, pockets of youthful joy shining through the fair's crowded, noisy sprawl. But alongside these ordinary memories crept details that unsettled, fragments of unease that did not fit neatly with the narrative of a festive night. Some recalled a man in a black hat who seemed to shadow the brothers' steps. He was tall, lean, and too still for a place of merriment. He did not laugh, did not join the games, but remained on the fringes, his eyes fixed on the boys in a way that chilled those who noticed. When asked later, descriptions of him never quite aligned. Some said he had a limp. Others insisted his eyes glowed strange in the lantern light. Yet all agreed he was there, and all agreed his attention was unnerving. Then came the scream. Few heard it clearly, muffled as it was beneath the sweep of carnival music. A woman selling pies near the livestock pen swore she heard a sharp cry cut through the fiddle tune, a sound of fear, short and stifled. She paused, listening, but the music drowned it almost as soon as it began. Nearby, animals began to panic. Horses stamped and pulled against reins, mules brayed, chickens flapped wildly within their cages. At the time, it was dismissed as the natural restlessness of animals in a crowd. In hindsight, it became one of the most haunting details in the testimonies. The fair, however, did not stop. The music played on, laughter filled the air, and the brothers moved deeper into its labyrinth of tents and wagons. That was when the strangest story took root, the story of the tent that vanished. Multiple witnesses, years later, insisted they saw the Carter brothers enter a striped tent pitched near the edge of the grounds. Inside, they said, flickered an odd dim light, and the sound of whispers leaked through the fabric. A friend of Henry's claimed he had almost followed them in, but something in the air felt wrong, as though the canvas itself pulsed like breathing skin. He turned away. The next morning, when the fair packed up, no such tent was found. Skeptics dismissed this as memory warped by time, or the invention of gossip hungry for mystery. Yet the consistency of those accounts unsettled even the most rational. If the 10th had existed, why did it vanish without trace? If it had not, why did so many swear they had seen it? Fact clashed with folklore, and the gap between them became the space where the brothers' fate was forever sealed. Other fragments from that night deepened the mystery. Some said Elijah was seen speaking with the man in the black hat near the fire pit, his face lit by orange glow, his expression strangely calm. Others claimed Henry was spotted alone, searching through the crowd as if looking for someone, his jaw set, fists clenched. A vendor remembered selling them fried cakes and hearing Elijah say something odd. "It doesn't end here." The night stretched on, lanterns dimmed, and families drifted home. The Carter brothers never did. When their mother awoke in the small hours, the silence of the house pressed against her. She told neighbors she thought she heard laughter outside, faint and far away, like an echo. But when she looked, the yard was empty, the fields hushed. By morning, panic spread. The fairgrounds were combed, questions asked, yet the answers stangled themselves into contradiction. Some swore the brothers had left together. Others insisted they were last seen apart. A few denied seeing them at all. The man in the black hat vanished as surely as the tent. The animals settled by dawn, their panic leaving no trace. What remained was absence. 2 boys who walked into a night of joy and did not return. To this day, historians and storytellers argue over the truth of that night. Was the scream nothing more than coincidence? Was the man in black simply a stranger, remembered only because tragedy made him significant? Was the tent a trick of memory, a story invented by minds desperate to explain the inexplicable? Or was it, as some whispered, a doorway, one that opened only once, taking the brothers with it? The fair became legend because it blurred the line between the ordinary and the unexplainable. It was a night meant for laughter that ended with silence. It was a place meant for celebration that became a grave of questions. And within its music, its lights and its shadows, the Carter brothers' fate slipped from the realm of fact into the grip of myth. Every retelling of that night sharpens its edges. Some focus on the human details, the joy of youth, the cruelty of chance, the failures of community. Others lean into the supernatural, weaving the man in black into a figure of folklore, the tent into a phantom carnival, the scream into an omen ignored. But no matter how it is told, one truth remains. The fair did not give the brothers back. And so the lanterns that once swayed above the Alabama fairground glow eternally in memory, casting long shadows where 2 boys walked and vanished, leaving behind only whispers and questions that no passage of time has ever been able to silence. The disappearance of Henry and Elijah Carter demanded answers, and in the weeks that followed the fair, the town of Ashford, Alabama, clung desperately to the promise of an investigation. Families whispered their fears in kitchens and at church pews, while farmers traded rumors along fence lines. The Carter mother, pale and hollow-eyed, waited for her door to open, for her sons to return. They never did. Instead, it was the sheriff who knocked. Sheriff Alistair Dodd was a man shaped by war. His coat bore stains of old tobacco, his boots the dust of county roads, and his eyes carried the weariness of too many unsolved crimes in a land still raw from the Civil War's aftermath. He walked into the Carter home with a notebook in hand and questions he already knew might not have answers. His official records, still preserved in the county archives, are frustratingly vague. They mention the fair, the boys last seen near the edge of the grounds, and theories that seem almost mechanical in their simplicity. Robbery was suggested, 2 young men taken by highwaymen eager for coin. Another entry lists runaway as a possibility, though those who knew the brothers scoffed at the idea. They had no reason to abandon their family. A drunken accident was also noted, as though perhaps the boys had stumbled into a creek or wandered into the woods under the influence of cheap liquor. But none of those theories aligned with what neighbors swore they saw. A farmer named Ezekiel Gray told the sheriff he found strange footprints in the woods the morning after the fair. They were large, uneven, and led only a short distance before stopping abruptly, as though the earth itself had swallowed the maker whole. He marked the spot with stones, but when the sheriff visited, the prints were gone. Whether they had faded, been disturbed, or never existed at all remains unclear. Other accounts deepened the unease. Letters written by townsfolk at the time speak of a smell of sulfur hanging in the woods, a stench so sharp it burned the nostrils. Some claimed the odor lingered for days, drifting near the fairgrounds as though clinging to the soil. For a community raised on scripture, the scent of sulfur was more than unpleasant. It was an omen, a whiff of damnation. Sheriff Dodd in his reports mentioned none of this. Instead, he clung to the rational. He questioned vendors, gathered names, and recorded times. He traced wagon routes, checked riverbanks, and even organized search parties through the woods. The men returned weary, muttering about birds falling silent as they walked, about finding patches of ground where grass seemed scorched. The sheriff dismissed such claims, chalking them up to fear, but his silence in the records only fanned the flames of rumor. The theories multiplied, each one reflecting the anxieties of the town. Some whispered of kidnapping, that the brothers had been taken by men trafficking laborers, a grim reality in the post-war South. Others suggested lynching, a dark suspicion born of Alabama's violent racial history, though no bodies were found and no confession surfaced. A few argued the brothers had succumbed to illness, struck down by fever or seizure, their remains hidden by animals or wilderness. Yet none of these explanations carried proof, and proof was what the Carter mother begged for. As rational theories faltered, supernatural ones took root. Children traded stories of witches who prowled the woods, luring the curious with flickering lights. Men swore the devil himself had walked the fairgrounds in human form, marked by the man in the black hat. Women recalled hearing sermons warning of restless spirits born of unrepented sin, and now they wondered if the Carter boys had crossed such a spirit on their way home. One of the most persistent rumors centered on the tent that vanished. Some claimed it was not a tent at all but a portal, an opening conjured by sorcery swallowing those who entered. Others said it was a traveling show from out of state, a sideshow of occultists who disappeared with their victims. The more the sheriff denied these tales, the more they spread, carried in hushed voices across Alabama's fields and churchyards. Psychologists today might call this a case of collective fear, a community traumatized by war, poverty, and uncertainty, desperate to frame its grief in stories that made sense of the senseless. To the townsfolk, though, fear was not an abstract diagnosis. It was a tangible presence, felt in the stillness of the woods, in the sulfur that clung to the air, in the memory of laughter that ended too abruptly. The sheriff's investigation dragged on for months, then quietly ended. His final entry listed the case as unresolved, with no evidence sufficient for conclusion. For the record books, the Carter brothers vanished without explanation. For the town, however, the story had only begun. Neighbors continued to report strange occurrences. A young girl walking near the woods claimed to see two figures standing at the tree line, watching her silently. When she blinked, they were gone. A preacher wrote in his journal that his Sunday sermon was interrupted by the sound of laughter. Two voices, distant yet distinct, echoing through the rafters. Farmers swore their livestock avoided certain clearings, circling wide as though something unseen lingered there. To some, these stories were proof that the boys were not gone at all but trapped, caught between worlds. To others, they were evidence of the town's guilt, its mind conjuring phantoms to mask a truth too ugly to face. Perhaps the boys had been murdered and buried in shallow graves. Perhaps someone powerful had ensured silence. Folklore, in this view, was less about spirits than about forgetting. Yet even in skepticism, doubt gnawed. If the boys had been killed, why were no bodies ever found? If they had run away, why leave behind coins, shoes, and family? If it was accident, why no trace? Every rational theory collapsed beneath the weight of absence. What endured were the inexplicable details. Footprints leading nowhere, sulfur that stung the nose, animals unsettled without cause. The Carter mother never stopped searching. She visited the fairground year after year, even after the lanterns stopped being lit and the music faded into memory. She said she could still hear her son's voices in the wind, calling faintly, just out of reach. Her grief became another thread in the tapestry of the story, a living reminder that beneath all the theories, robbery, witchcraft, accident, or curse, lay a mother's unanswered question. Where were her boys? The investigation left more shadows than light, and it is in those shadows that the legend of the Carter brothers grew. Rationality demanded one set of explanations. Folklore demanded another. The people of Ashford lived in the uneasy space between, where neither truth nor myth could be untangled from the other. And in that space, the case of the missing brothers transformed from tragedy into a haunting, a mystery that time could not bury, no matter how deeply the records tried to. The official records ended with silence. Sheriff Dodd closed his notebook, filed it under unsolved, and turned his attention to the next case. But the town of Ashford could not close its pages so easily. The brothers' absence was not a wound that scabbed. It bled into stories, into whispers, into nights broken by noises no one could explain. What the sheriff left blank, the people filled in, and those accounts passed from tongue to ear, became the bones of a legend that never died. The first testimony came within a week of the disappearance. A young girl named Clara Jensen, only 10 years old, told her mother she saw two shadows outside her bedroom window. She insisted they were the Carter boys. She knew their shapes, their height, the way one leaned slightly to the left. Clara claimed they stood silently beneath the moonlight, watching. When she screamed for her father, the figures melted into the darkness. Her account was dismissed as a child's imagination, until her father checked the ground outside and found small footprints in the dirt. Bare feet, even though both brothers had last been seen in boots. Then came the preacher. Reverend Samuel Wilkes had been preparing his Sunday sermon when he described hearing voices rise within the church walls. At first he thought it was a prank, boys mocking him from outside. But when he stepped out into the aisle, the voices grew louder, echoing against the rafters, though no one stood there. He wrote in his journal that the voices were young and laughing, yet sorrowful, as if belonging to souls who did not know whether to mourn or rejoice. His congregation whispered of it for weeks, torn between awe and dread. Other stories multiplied. The Carters' own parents swore they heard footsteps on their porch at night. 2 sets, light and hurried, circling the house as though boys were racing. Once the front door rattled violently as if someone tried to push their way inside. When the father opened it, the yard was empty, yet the boards creaked under invisible weight. The mother sat by the window and prayed, claiming she sometimes heard her son's laughter tangled in the sound of the wind. Neighbors experienced their own disturbances. Lamps flickered without cause. Horses bucked at shadows. A farmer's wife reported finding 2 plates set at her table one morning, though she had placed only 3 the night before. Another swore she saw the boys walking down the road at dusk, their faces pale, their eyes wide. She called after them, but they vanished behind a tree line that ended in open field. The testimonies grew darker. Some claimed the boys had become harbingers of misfortune. Crops failed mysteriously, patches of corn blackening overnight. A child drowned in a shallow creek, and her mother swore she heard laughter moments before the water took her. Families began speaking of a curse, that those who spoke too freely of the brothers would suffer. People started avoiding the Carters' home, leaving food at the gate instead of knocking at the door. Fear wrapped around the family as tightly as grief. Yet skepticism persisted. Many argued these accounts were grief-made visions. Psychologists today might call them hallucinations born of trauma. The mind replaying memories too painful to silence. The townsfolk had suffered war, famine, and loss. What was one more sorrow? Perhaps, they argued, the mother's prayers became voices in her head. Perhaps Clara's shadows were trees shifting in the wind. Perhaps the preacher's echoes were his own strained voice bouncing from the walls. But if these were illusions, why did they overlap? How could so many people describe laughter, footsteps, and shadows in such similar terms? Was it shared trauma or shared haunting? The preacher himself raised this question in his journals. He wrote, "Whether real or imagined, the spirits of these boys have become present among us. They walk not only our roads but our minds. In every silence, they linger." His words reveal the most unsettling possibility. That belief itself gave life to the hauntings. That the community, unable to accept uncertainty, conjured its own ghosts. As years passed, the testimonies did not fade. They multiplied, like seeds carried on the wind. Travelers passing through claimed to see lanterns glowing at the old fairground, long after the event had ended. A merchant swore he heard boys calling his name in the woods, though he had never met Henry or Elijah. Children dared each other to walk the road at night, swearing they felt a cold hand brush theirs. Some returned shaken, others proud, all convinced they had touched the boundary between life and death. The line between trauma and superstition blurred beyond recognition. For the Carter parents, the hauntings were a cruel mercy. To hear footsteps, to hear voices, was to know their sins were near, even if unreachable. For others, the hauntings were warnings, reminders that evil or injustice had gone unpunished. Either way, the brothers' presence grew larger in absence, more alive in rumor than in flesh. This section of the story reveals more than apparitions. It exposes how memory itself becomes myth. A child's claim becomes evidence. A preacher's echo becomes proof. A grieving parent's prayer becomes scripture. And slowly, piece by piece, the town reshaped the disappearance into something more than mystery. It became a haunting shared not just by the Carter family but by all of Ashford. And perhaps that is the most terrifying part. Not whether the brothers returned to shadows, but whether the town itself conjured them. Whether sorrow and fear were enough to twist reality, to give birth to visions that refused to fade. In that sense, the Carter brothers were never truly gone. They lived on in every shadow, every echo, every silence that trembled too long. The testimonies never aligned perfectly, yet they all carried the same burden, an absence made visible. And so, the people of Ashford were left to ask themselves, even decades later, Were they haunted by ghosts, or by grief too heavy to bear? The investigation may have ended with silence, but silence never kept hold of a community long. Where official answers failed, speculation flourished. The town of Ashford, left with no bodies and no closure, became a theater of theories. Every parlor, every church bench, every gathering in the marketplace became a stage for competing explanations of what happened to the Carter brothers. Some theories seemed reasonable, others lurid, and still others defied the bounds of rational thought. Together, they did not clarify the mystery. They multiplied it, turning fact into fable, grief into legend. The first and most obvious explanation was that the brothers had been murdered for money. From the earliest days following their disappearance, suspicion turned quickly to robbery. The Carter boys were known to be carrying pocket money saved from farm labor. Though it was not a fortune, in lean years even a few dollars could tempt the desperate. Sheriff Dodd himself scribbled this in his notebook. Possibility, robbed, bodies hidden. Neighbors whispered about drifters who passed through the fairground that week, men with hungry eyes and no names anyone remembered. Others speculated it was not strangers at all but locals, too proud to admit envy of the brothers' hard work. A farmhand who once argued over wages with Mr. Carter fell under suspicion. Rumors spread of blood on his shirt, though no evidence was ever presented. Still, the lack of bodies gnawed at the theory. Murder usually left traces, bones, clothes, at least a stain in the dirt, yet none were found. For some, this absence did not disprove murder, it confirmed it. A clever killer hides all he leaves behind, they said. And so the theory persisted, feeding suspicion among neighbors, creating divisions that outlasted the tragedy itself. Not long after, another explanation arose, one that reflected both fascination and fear of the strange. A traveling caravan of performers had indeed been near Ashford during the time of the disappearance. Some townsfolk whispered that the brothers had been lured or even sold into the freak show circuit. The theory painted a picture of the boys dragged away in the night, forced to play roles in far-off carnivals, their identities erased beneath grease paint and costumes. Those who supported this idea pointed to tales of children stolen by traveling troops in other states. They spoke of a boy spotted in Mississippi months later who looked strikingly like Henry, playing a tambourine beside a bearded woman. Historians later traced this rumor, finding no solid link. The carnival troupe recorded no new performers that year, but the legend took hold. It fit the town's fear of outsiders, of rootless wanderers with secrets in their wagons. The freak show theory revealed less about the brothers' fate and more about the townsfolk's suspicion of anyone who didn't belong. Yet no theory captured imaginations or nightmares like that of the Midnight Man. Long before the Carters vanished, Alabama folklore told of a figure who came when the clock struck 12. He was said to walk the roads searching for wayward children, or sometimes for those who bore hidden guilt. His arrival was marked by a chill wind, the smell of sulfur, or the sound of laughter in the dark. After the brothers disappeared, sightings of the Midnight Man multiplied. Some swore they saw a tall figure in black near the fairground, carrying a lantern whose light never touched the ground. Others claimed the boys had spoken of him days before, joking nervously that they hoped he would not collect them after dark. The Midnight Man legend carried all the features of folklore: fear of the night, punishment for disobedience, warnings against wandering too far. In time, the Carter disappearance became its strongest proof. Parents told their children, "Stay indoors after dark, or the Midnight Man will take you like he took the Carter boys." For folklorists, this theory reveals how trauma morphs into cautionary tale. For the townsfolk, it offered an answer no sheriff could disprove. And in the minds of the grieving, perhaps it was easier to believe in a supernatural thief than in the cruelty of neighbors or the randomness of chance. Modern psychologists looking back suggest that the proliferation of theories reflects the community's attempt to cope with uncertainty. A human mind struggles against unanswered questions, and so it creates explanations, even improbable ones, to fill the void. Robbery, carnival abduction, and supernatural abduction each mirrored aspects of the town's psyche. The murder theory exposed distrust of one another. The freak show theory revealed prejudice against outsiders. The Midnight Man reflected deep cultural folklore. Each theory was less about the brothers and more about the people left behind. One psychologist wrote, "When the facts run dry, people turn inward. They begin to see their fears projected outward." Theories are not explanations, they are mirrors. Historians, in turn, approach the case like puzzle pieces scattered too widely to assemble. Some sided with the robbery theory, pointing to crime trends of the late 19th century. Others favored the freak show story, noting how similar rumors circulated across the South. Still, others dismissed all supernatural claims, labeling them folk panic. Yet historians too admitted the unsolved nature of the disappearance allowed myth to overpower memory. With no closure, theories outlived evidence. Every historian's article ended the same way, with acknowledgement that none of the explanations fully satisfied. What began as local speculation eventually spread. Traveling merchants carried the tale to neighboring towns. Soon the Carter disappearance was no longer just Ashford's mystery. It was Alabama's ghost story. Folklore books recorded it. Preachers used it as sermon warnings. By the turn of the century, ballads were sung of the two brothers who walked into the fair and never walked out. Some versions painted them as innocent victims, others as sinners taken for their pride. Each retelling twisted the details, but all agreed. The mystery was never solved. Theories thus merged into legend. Murder, abduction, and Midnight Man became threads of the same tapestry. And the more time passed, the less anyone cared which theory was true. The story had outgrown truth. It had become myth. Ultimately, the theories reveal more about Ashford than about Henry and Elijah. Fear of neighbors, fear of strangers, fear of the supernatural, all found voice in competing explanations. Each theory preserved the brothers in memory, but none brought peace. The town was left with an unsolvable paradox. To stop theorizing was to admit ignorance. To keep theorizing was to deepen fear. And so theories continued, even decades later, whispered in dark rooms, told to children at bedtime, recited whenever someone vanished without a trace. The Carter disappearance thus lives not in fact but in legend. Murder, carnival, Midnight Man. Each theory is a mirror of a community unable to let go, unwilling to live without answers. What remains is not truth, but a haunting narrative shaped by fear, retold by generations, and anchored by the chilling possibility that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. The fairground today lies quiet, its lanterns long extinguished, its laughter reduced to an echo only memory can hear. The soil has shifted, the wooden stalls have rotted, and the music of fiddles has been swallowed by the wind. Yet in Ashford, Alabama, silence has never truly settled. Every creak of the trees, every groan of an abandoned barn, seems to carry a whisper of the two brothers who vanished on that fateful night in 1873. Some say the land itself remembers, that the earth beneath the fairground holds more than footsteps, more than trampled hay, more than the shadows of crowds that once gathered. It holds a story that refuses burial. The brothers never returned home, but they never left either. Their absence became a presence, a ghostly weight pressing on the town's conscience. For some it was a cautionary tale. Beware of strangers, beware of arrogance, beware of the night. For others, it was a wound that would not close, the kind of wound that festers when truth is denied. And for still others it became a legend, proof that evil wears many masks. Sometimes human, sometimes spectral, sometimes an invention of fear itself. The Carter case was never solved, but perhaps that was the point. Some mysteries demand answers. Others demand belief. If they were murdered, then somewhere someone lived their life carrying a secret as heavy as the grave. If they were taken by a carnival, then perhaps their faces were glimpsed beneath painted lights in towns far away, forever trapped in someone else's spectacle. And if the Midnight Man came for them, then their laughter, last heard by their mother, may still wander in the darkness, caught between this world and the next. Each theory offers a window, but none shows the full house. Each answer soothes but never satisfies. The real horror is not knowing, and perhaps that is why the story has survived longer than the lives it consumed. Generations later, children still whisper about the Carter brothers when the air turns cold. Parents invoke their names to keep little ones inside after sundown. Travelers pass through Ashford and hear locals lower their voices when the fairground is mentioned, as though the ground itself is listening. What happened that night has become larger than truth. It has become myth woven into the fabric of Alabama's folklore. And yet, behind every myth lies something, some spark of reality, some fracture of fact. The question is whether that spark was human cruelty or something beyond the veil of reason. The fairground is empty now, but stand there at midnight and you may feel it. Ash shift in the air, a weight on the chest, a sound half heard. Was it the rustle of trees, or was it laughter, two voices entwined, fading into the night? The records are silent. The testimonies conflicted. The theories endless, but the whispers remain. And so the story ends not with closure, but with a challenge whispered across the decades. Do you believe the brothers simply vanished? Or were they taken,